Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're watching this from. It's time for the space weather update, and today is July 16th, 2024. We will go ahead and get started. Pretty active conditions here on the sun as we start the middle part of July. We have quite a number of active regions and sunspot groups here on the Earth-facing disk currently, well positioned all over the disk, including the northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. So they are spread apart across the disk pretty homogeneously, um, and so activity over the next maybe 5 to 7 days should be kind of on the sustained side. You can see we have active region 3738, which is here on the westernmost portion of the disk, and will be rotating off pretty soon. This was responsible for an X-class flare this morning, earlier this morning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video. But regardless, 3738 is probably one of the most prominent sunspot groups on this Earth-facing disk that we need to be monitoring. And then this one here, 3751, which is back in the eastern portion of the disk, is also going to be another more interesting sunspot group to watch for the potential for solar flares over the coming days. And we also have a nice sort of cluster here in the southwestern portion of the disk that comprises 3742, 3743, 45, and 47. So these may be responsible as well for some level of activity as we traverse the coming days, and as that moves closer to the western portion of the disk. So this is kind of the threat characteristic here, with 3751 receiving the most amount of threat in terms of eruptive activity and flaring activity, and then this larger sort of area of activity here, sunspot activity towards the southwest, should also be keep an eye on. Okay, so that essentially wraps up the sunspot activity. We'll look forward now to the coronagraphs over the last 24 hours or so. We have kind of a lot going on here visually to look at. We'll start around 0Z or so on the 16th, and right into the start of the day today, we have a very fast, prominent moving CME off of the eastern limb, and we'll talk a little bit about these. I'm just going to run through all of the imagery first. We also have a more slowly moving, almost filamentary-like CME here, very slow, but needless to say, it is off of the southwestern portion of the disk, right around about in the 800 hour or so, maybe 8:30. We have a faint CME here, a new one, which is seen to sort of catch up with this front, which is moving to the southwest. So there is a faint CME here, and then we have another prominent eruption. This eruption is an interesting one, in that it is associated with that X-class flare, as we had talked about earlier. What's interesting about it, it has this sort of ill-defined front, kind of a dimpled front in this particular CME. So a lot of CMEs to look at here today. Of note for Earth is probably going to be this one here, this faint one to the north and the west. And we'll talk a little bit about that soon, if you stay with me. So let's take a look at the imagery here, as we can see what has happened over the last 24 hours. This imagery starts right around 0Z on the 16th, and there is the source of that very fast eruption that occurred right around 0Z. So this one is not likely to impact Earth. It is right on the eastern limb there. You can see it was kind of a expulsive outburst of plasma here. As you can see right on the eastern limb, this is STO 193 imagery. And as we move forward, not a ton here on the Earth-facing disk. Right around here, 12 o'clock, you see a brightening in this region. This is active region 3738, which is due to rotate off shortly. And you see these magnetic field lines beyond the western limb just completely transform. and they seem to be sort of blown away in the imagery. So that indicates a strong CME has occurred with this flare here. So there is, as I loop through, you can see that eruptive activity a little bit better. And we'll take a look at the flare itself. This is the best wavelength probably for the actual flare. This is 131, SDO 131. And as you see, that is the time at which the flare took place, right around 1343 or so, somewhere around there, today on the 16th. So this is an X2 class flare from 3738. And you can also see as it occurs, there is a bit of plasma that is released off here to the western portion of the disk. So this was an eruptive flare. Generally with these more significant flares on the western limb, we're not expecting an Earth-directed solar storm or coronal mass ejection, but these flaring events may actually cause solar energetic particle events at Earth. And during these flares, you can have energetic particles which are accelerated near the site of the flare. And they travel along magnetic field lines that are curved in space. So they will actually reach Earth. You can think of it as radiation. So we are sort of keeping an eye on the radiation monitors and energetic particle monitors today as a result of this flare. The solar storm, the coronal mass ejection aspect of, or the eruptive aspect of this particular flare is not likely to be a threat for Earth. So probably no large geomagnetic storms from this particular event. And then here's another view. This is perhaps one of the better views to see activity beyond the limb. This is actually a different spacecraft altogether. It's GOES 16. And you can really see the flare occur here with very fast diverging magnetic field lines here and magnetic flux right beyond the western limb. So that's another indication that there was a significant CME occur. This is the solar region summary, which gives you an idea of the magnetic classification of all the different sunspot regions. And again, 3738 is beta gamma delta, meaning that it harbors more magnetic complexity and harbors the ability for greater chance, essentially, for more significant flares. And then we also have 3751, which is beta gamma, and that is this one here, off towards the southeastern portion of the disk. So this should be interesting over the next 2 days or so to see if there are any significant flares from this active region. And if so, we'll keep an eye to see if those corresponding flares have corresponding solar storms that are erupting from it. So this could be interesting in the next 2 to 3 days, 3751. Okay, just a quick look at some of the source locations for some of the CMEs that were pointed out. We'll go back to this coronagraph here. So we saw this one. This one was the one on the eastern limb. And then we have this kind of faint one here, which I'll get into in just a second. And then this very bright one, that bright one is associated with that flare, the X2 class flare. So these are the parameters for the easternmost one, right around minus 90 degrees longitude. And then this one here is associated with the X2 class flare. So not likely to impact Earth at this point. It's probably going to be out towards Mars and the OSIRIS mission. Had a velocity of about 826 kilometers per second. This is the interesting one here. It was that faint one that occurred to the north and west. So the source longitude for this could be around 30 degrees in longitude and a latitude of 23. So it is a fairly slow event, just coming in around 300 kilometers per second. So it's on the slower side. But needless to say, there is a chance, looking at this simulation for that particular event, that Earth could get sort of a minor impact from it over the coming days. And that minor impact is forecast around the 20th, 10Z, 10 Zulu, or 10 Universal Time on the 20th. Not expecting, these are the potential ranges of the KP from 2 to 4, so not expecting a major impact, but needless to say, this is something that space weather forecasters will keep an eye on over the coming days in the solar wind data to see if the CME arrived at Earth. Okay, so now we're moving over to the timelines. The timelines here show, this top left timeline shows the GOES primary X-ray flux and is how we measure the solar flares. And you can see the flaring activity up until today had been generally on the quiet side. We did have right around 3Z today, so things have really, things have really picked up today. And I'll see if I can make this last 3 days. So things have been quiet back on the 15th, generally speaking, and later portion of the 14th. But today we have certainly much more solar activity to speak of. So we had an M class flare here. It looks like about M3 and change. And then we had this X2 class flare. And that X2 class flare was the one on the western limb that we talked about. Right now, the proton flux, or the radiation, most of the energy channels are on the quiet side right now. This brown line represents the greater than 1 mega electron volt channel, and you can see that that is sort of higher than all of the other channels, but irregardless, it's not at a very high level or anything. So most of these energy channels are sort of, pretty converged with each other. You can see that there was sort of a small increase above the background if you look at the last sort of 7 days. Yeah, you can see the purple line. If you keep your eye on the purple line there, the purple line does sort of increase just a little bit here. So that's an indication that there was sort of a small, very small arrival of particles associated with some of these flares. Probably the flare, this increase really started on the 15th. So this may have been in association with some of the previous flares, not today's flares, most likely. The electron flux is pretty quiet right now, less than 100 or so particle flux units. And our KP right now has been, we're going to talk a little bit about this a little bit more as we get into the solar wind, but generally speaking, this was kind of a dud this weekend in terms of geomagnetic activity. You can see there was a small increase right around 0Z on the 16th, which was today, this morning. And we'll talk about the reasoning for that. But generally speaking, there was a minor geomagnetic storm watch up for this past weekend, and we didn't really see anything from it. We were expecting the potential arrival of a CME from the 9th of July, and as well as a coronal hole high-speed stream arrival. And we did, I think, eventually see the coronal hole high-speed stream arrival, but unfortunately the whole signature was just on the weak side. So we didn't really get any major geomagnetic activity from that. So this is the last 3 days of the solar wind here, and this kind of reconfirms basically it reconfirms the fact that there's not terribly much going on here in terms of arrival signatures that are significant. We did have an arrival signature starting right around this morning, very late in the Zulu day yesterday. You can see this black line. This is the total magnetic field strength, and this did increase from 4 and eventually got all the way up to 17, 18 nanoteslas. So this definitely is an arrival signature. Probably going to be associated with a very small coronal hole high-speed stream that we were sort of anticipating. We were actually anticipating this back on the 13th and 14th, so kind of a late arrival. If this signature here is associated with that high-speed stream, then it is quite late, later than anticipated. You don't see much of a velocity increase with this as well. We were sitting prior to that arrival around 300 to 320 kilometers per second, and now maybe closer to 350, 360, generally speaking. So not a huge solar wind velocity increase here. Right now, things are actually picking up closer to about 400 kilometers per second, and the temperature is also up. But at this stage, it looks like most of this arrival signature is kind of weakening now. Another reasoning for the lack of, and let me turn on the KP index so you can see sort of where we were standing with the KP index. That's this green bar down here. So this increase here that we had talked about in the KP, we had a couple periods of 3.33. So that main contributing factor for that is this period right here of sustained southward magnetic field. That's where this red line sort of dips below 0 and is kind of sustained in the negative sector. You can see that the value was -6, -7, something like that nanoteslas. So that is the proper orientation for a disturbed magnetic field and an increase in geomagnetic activity. But you can see it didn't really last very long. So it started around 22 or so and ended around 0. So maybe just 2 hours or so. And the signature is fairly weak because, we'd like to see this sustained southward magnetic field. At the same time, we're also seeing very high solar wind speeds. So kind of the solar wind speeds being on the low side, as well as this, you see the magnetic field eventually, the southward component of the magnetic field, or B sub Z, eventually takes a ride mostly into the positive sector for this event. So this is not going to really generate any major geomagnetic storms given the rest of the parameters, especially the wind speed being very low. So that's kind of the reasoning for why we did not see KP4 and KP5 out of this particular event. Magnetic field strength was, the total magnetic field strength of 17 and 18 is definitely supportive of a storm. And that's why we had called for the potential for active geomagnetic conditions, or even a minor geomagnetic storm yesterday. But the magnetic field orientation didn't really allow us to get there, essentially. So that is about it for today's video. Hopefully this was helpful. And really the only thing that we're tracking today is potential more solar flares from this active region before it rotates off 3738. We're also watching for flares from this active region 3751. And then also potentially the arrival of a very faint CME, which started right around 8:30 or so here in the northwest. So this one will probably arrive around the 20th or so of July. So that's about 4 days or so from now. But other than that, things could, with the number of sunspot regions that we have, things could get pretty interesting pretty quickly over the coming days. We'll have to see. But hopefully you found this video useful, and thanks so much for tuning in. Hope to see you again in the next video. Take care.